Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here in this philosophy symposium in Forêt, in the Philosophy House. I find it really an honor to be here. It's a very vibrant philosophical environment. So thank you very much. And now I have a very difficult task to present a paper of how to save the planet. So this is really a challenge. And I could also say it's actually a practical problem. We move from the more philosophical discussion to the practical discussion. And of course, the question is, what does philosophy has to say to practice? I could start by citing Karl Marx, saying philosophers have interpreted the world, now we need to change it, now we need to act. So this is the context of my paper. I should say when we talk about the environmental threat today, the problem of the environment, we must, I think now say that the environmental challenge or the destruction of the environment is a fact. It's not a question more of interpretation of this fact. And we can say we have the destruction of biodiversity. Now we have perhaps only 70% left of the species that we had 50 years ago. There's a problem of climate change, the whole destruction of the climate, the global warming is a challenge. And we could also mention the plastic problem, the global plastic problem, you know, the plastic island in the Pacific Ocean, which some people say is bigger than France. It's unbelievable, the destruction of the planet. So you could say this has been said by philosophy for a long time. We had, for example, nearly 30 years ago, we talked about the bioethical turn, meaning that philosophy should integrate bioethics. We should think about the animals and we should think about nature as a part of what is important for philosophy. So there is a bioethical turn. I have myself been taking part of a group, East-West reflecting group, which is called Ecoetica. And Ecoetica is about ecoethics. It's not only about the environment, but it is about the globe, the ethics of the globe. And you can say, when we talk about ethics of the globe, this is also a cosmopolitan challenge. We need to unite to find solution to this global destruction. This is a cosmopolitan challenge. And of course, when we talk about ecoethics, we also talk about what is called the technological conjuncture, that we live in close interaction with technology. Technology is a part of human beings, and of course the technology is both destructive, you know, with the atom bomb, but also the technology can help us to perform a green transition for a future of the world. We have earlier today have this discussion about the clash of civilizations and the problem of world culture. How can the cultures in the world unite to deal with the problem of environmental destruction? So that is a challenge, and what could philosophers do? There, of course, the problem is which philosophers should I choose? Should I choose a specific philosopher and say, here's a solution? For example, Karl Marx has a solution, or Adam Smith has a solution. We actually, in our earlier discussions today, we face a problem of different cultures in the world. And I was reflecting about what is my point of view. I have a certain facticities coming from Denmark, from Europe, and there's also, for example, the facticity of the citizen here or in another country. So we have this problem of finding a common position from where we can act. And it is in this context that I'm also working in business ethics and political philosophy, philosophy of law. It is there I have been very interested in the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. And there, I think if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we could say that they follow up on a certain kind of philosophy. We started with the German philosopher Hans Jonas, who talked about there's only one principle. This is the imperative of responsibility for the future. This is a future ethics. So there's this idea, first of all, I have to preserve the globe for future generations. So that's a principle of Hans Jonas, and I think if we look at sustainable development, the Brundtland report by the Norwegian politicians, Brundtland, or the World Commission on the Environment, that made this report in 1987, was the first step for this global development. And if you look at the report from 87, you see a strong focus on the environment. Then what happened was we had the Millennium Goals in year 2000. Nobody ever discovered the Millennium Goals. And then in 2015 came the Sustainable Development Goals. And from a philosophical point of view, what is interesting by the Sustainable Development Goals, I think number one is actually that sustainability is not only environmental sustainability. Principle number one, or sustainable goal number one, is eradication of poverty. But of course, this creates a big problem because you also have a goal called what about growth? What about economic growth? Can you eradicate poverty, have economic growth, and preserve the environment? That's, I think, the big question for a philosopher. How do we solve this problem? So that's one of the challenges. But I think also in the Sustainable Development Goals, a second point I find extremely important is goal number 17. And this is the question of partnerships. The way to solve the problem is not only the state. The state is not the solution, because you also have businesses and you have civil society. To solve these global problems, you need all these groups to work together. And it's interesting, if you look at the basis for the Sustainable Development Goals, there was the discussion that businesses said, we also want to participate in these goals for a more sustainable future. So what is a challenge for philosophy is also to think partnerships. And it's very interesting that the responsibility of the state is of course the responsibility of the state is to follow the Sustainable Development Goals. You have the social goals, for example, education, a good economy, taking care of the citizens, and then you have the environmental goals, for example, preserve the ocean, preserve nature, and so on. That's of course a topic for the state. We talked about basic citizens' rights, and there's of course political and social rights, but there's also economic and cultural rights. So that's important task for the state. But the idea of partnership means that also businesses should contribute, that the private sector is also involved in this ethical responsibility. So it's interesting to see with business, before you said the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, to make money. The old economist Friedman said that. But with the new vision, you have another vision of a business, because a business has to contribute to social development. So what we call the political cooperation. And some people are critical of this because can a corporation be political? It's only making money. But a third element is, of course, the civil society. And here you have civil society organizations, NGOs, but you also have the individual citizen. And what I find interesting is, by the Sustainable Development Goals, is that it moves from a very abstract idea of sustainability to link to personal responsibility. So there's a certain responsibilization of each individual. So we are all responsible in this way. For example, you have plastic. You are all responsible for not throwing away plastic in nature and so on. We are all responsible at this level. So that is a very interesting part of the concept of partnership. So I think if we take philosophy, of course, if we then should look at the Sustainable Development Goals from the philosophical point of view, I think one key point is we need to preserve the vision. We need to see what is actually the philosophy behind these goals. And here I would say, is it a Western concept of, for example, you have the philosopher John Rawls. You have the difference principle saying inequality should only be in favor. It's only acceptable when it is in favor of the worst off. So you could say there's a welfare principle behind the Sustainable Development Goals based on John Rawls' political philosophy. But you could also mention, for example, Amartya Sen, and say that there's a capability approach. And Amartya Sen's capability approach is the idea that to have a flourishing society, you need to give individual capabilities. You cannot have a good economy if you don't have a certain level of individual freedom of autonomy. And that's Sen tries to justify this also with empirical economic theory. But the idea is capability is essential for development. So there's also this link between personal responsibility for Sustainable Development Goals and then individual capabilities of developing an economic system. So that's a positive interpretation of philosophers, but you also have critical views on the Sustainable Development Goals. First of all, you could say, is this a Western concept developed in New York, very far from the developing countries? Where you say this is something coming from the top. For example, you could say the original people in some countries didn't have this problem of exploration of nature because there was a harmony with nature. We could say that historically philosophers should look at visions of the harmony with nature in each culture and try to promote that when we talk about sustainability. So there's of course this idea, can we have an interpretation of Sustainable Development Goals that includes all cultures in the world, or different countries? For example, the tension between the Global South and the Western countries. And here, of course, I think it's important with the Sustainable Development Goals that eradication of poverty is goal number one. Because you actually have the idea that everybody should reach the same level of social development. But of course, it goes back to the tension. How do we do this? And here we could, of course, talk about we need a new ecological economy. We need the green transition. And there's also been this idea of an economy that finds the right balance between social and environmental dimension. So that's some of the aspects. I think my talk is a lot about how can philosophers make sense of politics of sustainability in the concrete context of development in each country. And to mention a final criticism, of course philosophers can also be critical. And here we could have the discussion about greenwashing or sustainability washing. For example, you see, or cosmetics, or we had earlier, there was a question of the double standard. How can we interpret the Sustainable Development Goals in a sense that they become meaningful for societies? That could be a challenge for philosophy, because we actually see a lot of criticism of this agenda of sustainability. And this is also a question of empowerment, because you can say, if a state say we need to be sustainable and there's no empowerment in society, and you see that the state doesn't follow this vision, how can you really work for sustainable development? So, okay, thank you very much.
All right, so to maximize the amount of time that we have for the sake of interaction between our speaker and the audience, I'm going to go straight to questions.
So, Professor, it seems to me at least that the question of whether growth and sustainability of the two of them sort of like coexisting seems kind of impossible, evident by the fact that we're unofficially living in the age of the like Anthropocene, and that sort of gives evidence that we are sort of reaching this like finitude in terms of the resources of the earth. So this idea of like a steady state economy where the economies would not grow, that seems to be quite antithetical to the idea of recycling and like reusing. So isn't it quite obvious that no, that the idea of like yearly growth, of continuous exponential growth, that is clearly like hitting the ceiling in terms of the like resources that are already available, and we do have to face the hard truth that the economic system that we have set up will only just like make the problem worse.
Professor Rindorf, thanks a lot for your talk. And I have one question about our responsibility for the future. And you cite Hans Jonas' words that it's our imperative responsibility for the future. And my question is, whose future is in question here? Our own future, our descendants, our environment, nature, or our planet, as shown in the title of your talk? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take two more questions and then.
Okay.
And then.
Assalamu alaikum. There is in Google talking about the Cambridge University. They talk about planet genetic evaluation of the human. I want you, sir, to give me the philosophy of this talking about exactly that we have in our stomach, which is that something that can make the cellulose in our body be good when we eat and planet food. So that one.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
One more, and then.
Thank you, Professor Jacob, for the speech. This is Ahmed Al-Khaldi. And it's fascinating how we can see how the SDGs link between the personal and the collective responsibility. However, this also reminds me when we were studying the Enlightenment, and some of the philosophers were suggesting that business people cannot do politics, for example, because they have their personal interest that will go an opposite side with the collective interest. If they were, of course, focusing on the political aspect of this idea. However, now if we were to think about it from an environmental aspect, we have business people in in politics, so their personal interest going against these fundamental aspects of SDGs. So if we were to think about the practicality and the applicability of SDGs in this light, in light of the Enlightenment philosophy, how applicable the SDGs are.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. Of course, you raise the problem, do we need this growth? And if we look at, we have already used a citizen of Denmark in March, they have already used what corresponds to one globe, so to say. So if everybody should live like a citizen as Denmark, they would need four globes, planets, because they start to use the resources that are already there. So they don't make new resources. So of course you're right, we need the growth. On the other hand, it's very difficult because we all want to live maximum lives. The problem is. So the optimistic solution would be, of course, a green transition. The airplanes that fly on electricity, remove plastic from the supermarkets, a new kind of clothes. So thinking creatively about the future. And of course, this would involve some kind of degrowth, but could we do it in a way that it would be a future with hope for the future, so to say? I think a part of the European Union combined aesthetics with the green transition. So the green transition is also something about living a new life. For example, if you want vegetarian food, there's a restaurant in Copenhagen. It's top vegetarian food. Nobody wants to eat animals after they've been to this restaurant. So it becomes also a question of aesthetics. It's how you feel about it, and it becomes a fashion to live in a green way. So that would be the answer to this question. And of course, for whom the responsibility? The problem is that we cannot conceive future individuals. They don't exist. So that's, of course, a problem for philosophy. So we could say, now we decide to have a nice life, use all the resources, and then it's the end of the globe. But there, Hans Jonas' key idea is there's something in the mind that says this is not possible. It's a moral law, so to say. You need to preserve the planet for a future. But of course, whose future is it? The Sustainable Development Goals give also an answer, I think. It's the relation between the social and the environmental. It's not only a future for the planet without human beings. It's a common future. But I think the key imperative of responsibility is very important in this context, and it is very new because it's a future-oriented ethics. And then, of course, to your question about it's a question of food, that we need a new food. We need to think about food, and of course the question of our habits. We need to be creative about our habits. Why, for example, in some countries, people eat a lot of animals and cows, and there's of course the whole ethical issue. Why do we need to respect the animals? The animal is reduced to an industrial animal in many countries, industrial agriculture and so on, and that's really something we need to rethink. But of course, it's very difficult. There's a certain moral blindness in the system that we want to change it, but we cannot. And to your question, I think we need to also acknowledge that business people are human beings, so to say. They also, that's a question of virtue of a business person, and And I think, as I work in business ethics myself, but many philosophers think that business is it's not very important. They think it's below the mind of a philosopher who lives in the cave or in the armchair. But they should be more in contact with business, because there's a certain creativity in business. But of course, business also, the whole question is, can we create an economy, an ethical economy? And I, you know, Google Scholar. As a researcher, you can put your key term in Google Scholar. I'm the only one who have put ethical economy. So that shows a problem.
All right, so we'll go to the next round of questions. We have Dr. Tong Dong Bai first.
Thank you for the lecture. Just 2 points. The first, you're talking about the tension between development and the environment. I won't say, probably the problem is even more serious, because poor people tend to occupy environmentally challenging land. So for them to develop, the environmental damage is going to be great. So I think it's really, really serious issue. And my more kind of challenging point is this, so talking about the imagination of philosophers, right? I think I have a book, and in the book I call it "Climate Change is a Perfect Storm for Democracy," because democracy is rely on voters, and voters tend to vote on their short-term interests. As you said, environmental issues are about long-term interests. So it's something voters are not very good at, right? And also, environmental issues tend to about future generations. They don't have votes, right? They cannot affect decisions today. Also, they tend to affect a minority of people within a state. Also, among states, some Pacific Islanders, they are affected the most. But in a sort of a democratic framework, either within a state or internationally, it's very difficult for those who suffer from them to have an influence, real influence, through the democratic regime. So in that sense, I think maybe there's something more. We need to do some kind of regime change in order to address the climate issue. Thank you.
Okay, second question from the first row.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacob. I think it's good to go back in our context, philosophical context, to go back to Descartes, who used to say at that time, the human reason is capable to dominate nature. Dominate nature, it means today pollution, it means global warming, etc. I think it's a great time now, as you said, to manage the nature. And it's urgent to have or to take some conditions to establish this thing and to continue to survive in our earth. The first condition, we need less weapons in this world. And it's a big industry, especially in the Western and other countries. This is one of the most difficult things are polluting the world. The second thing, less war, to respect neighborhood. I can burn my neighborhood, but to save my country. It's not a good thing if we follow Hans Jonas, the principle of responsibility. We have to go in the same way to respect neighborhood too. The third thing, you said that, less chemical products. And responsibility today, to finish, is to have a minimum of ethic to survive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a very short period of time, so 5 minutes. First in the second row, please, doctor, and last two questions from the back.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob, for this conference. I'm not sure I've really understood you, and I'm not sure whether this effort to preserve our planet is a collective effort or an individual effort, because you are seeming to say that we should enable individuals to participate, to take part in this job of preserving our planet. But I don't think it's really responsible to say that, because it is a matter of politics. I mean, you say less state and more individuals and more civil society. Yes, theoretically. But in fact, those who are really destroying our planets are not individuals. They are systems, they are states. So please, can you answer me on this?
Thank you. Okay, so we have time for two last questions, I think, from the back row. Very brief, please.
That's right. Thank you very much. And you mentioned that Karl Marx and Adam Smith were giving us certain kind of solutions. So how can we live further? I don't know whether save the world, but how to live. So what is Professor Rindorf's way? Is it in what sphere is it actually laying? Is it ethics? And second point, you mentioned personal responsibility and personal also autonomy as a way of saving the world. Okay, but in the Eastern mentality, as you also mentioned, personal autonomy is very limited, and I would say it's not existing as a phenomenon, initially. So how would we save this issue? And who would save the world? Does it mean that Westerns should save the world and won't listen to the Eastern? So what will be the solution?
Okay, Dr. Rentdorf, you have one minute, 1 minute or two to answer all these
this question about democracy, I think we need to respect democracy, and that's the task that people understand the problem. That's the way. For example, how do you? These kind of deliberative discussions, they sometimes take a long time, but they may actually create a certain understanding of things. And I think that's why I mentioned that you need, in order to make the great transition working, you need people to be involved, and that's why you need them to make it. It's our responsibility of the democratic transition, and that's why you need to combine politics with ethics and aesthetics. That it's also because we simply create a better and a more beautiful world. And of course, with you, I agree that it's crazy. You have the states in New York all vote for sustainable development goals, and then they start wars everywhere. What is this mentality? And nobody talked about the sustainability problem of the war. For example, the war in Russia with Ukraine. The environmental damage is enormous but that's of course also all the human beings who are dying. But of course, what is it that's why you could say the politicians need philosophy. Why is the state is like the state system? Go back to the European state system, go back to the peace in 1648, and the states, they work with these historical understandings. It's a logic of a system beyond individuals, and that's of course a problem. And that's my answer to you. It's not that I'm a libertarian in the sense I say only individual can do this work. Of course, you need to convince states also, but the states did a very good thing when they said. The Sustainable Development Goals involves both states civil society and business, because it made it a common endeavor. I have talked with, it's interesting when you go to people in Denmark and talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, everybody thinks, now I can do something. But of course, your problem, you're right in the say, is it's a systemic problem, in the sense that I start to do something and nothing changes because the system is much bigger than me. That's of course a problem. But I think we need at some level to be involved, all of us. And this would eventually also change the mentality of the state, because the citizens will to some degree express their opinions. So I think I would see it as a dialectic between individual and collective. It's not that we need to move to individuals, but we need to empower individuals in the state. And then of course the final question, it's true, the East, but Imam Ishi, in his book about ecoetica, he tells a story that he actually says that the East had a concept of virtue, which was important for individual responsibility before the West. It was the Eastern concept of virtue linked to the way to the environment, and then later on, the West developed the concept of person, and he says the concept of accountability only emerged around the 14th century and so on. So it's interesting. I think there's in the East, in a traditional Confucian philosophy, there is an element of empowerment, of responsibility, which can be used to understand this environmental responsibility. And then the problem of what is my own opinion, and I'm in the hermeneutic tradition, so we make interpretation, and that's of course a problem. You end up with too many interpretations, but I think it's a good idea to take the Sustainable Development Goals and try to interpret what is actually the meaning. You know, like a lawyer interprets the law, that you try to find out what did the politician actually think with these goals? What were their intent and how do we realize them?
All right, thank you very much again once Dr. Renthoff.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacob and Dr. Kurt. Thank you, Dr. Jacob, for your vision and for your precious thoughts.